So, welcome everyone. My name is Tori Nagash, and I serve as the Research Initiatives Manager at ACUHO-I, and I am excited to welcome you today to our endorsed research webinar titled Living in Crisis, Evaluating Secondary Trauma Among Live-in Residential Life Staff. A significant focus of the ACUHO-I research agenda is disseminating research about housing and residence life, and the endorsed research program is one of the ways that we work to achieve this. ACUHO-I and the ACUHO-I Research Committee invite endorsed research applications on issues related to campus housing, including those that align with the future of the profession focus areas. Applications are reviewed as they are received on a rolling basis throughout the year. If you're interested in learning more about the endorsed research program or other ACUHO-I research endeavors, you can find information on our website under resources in the research and assessment area. You can also always email research@acuhoi.org with any questions. And then just finally, a few housekeeping notes before we begin, which would be that the live transcript closed captioning feature is enabled, so you have access to subtitles during the webinar. This is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the ACUHO-I YouTube channel. I will also share a link to the recording with all of those who registered for the webinar. And if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to post those in the chat, but they may not be answered until the end of the session. And with that, I will now turn things over to our presenter.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone see my screen perfectly? Perfect. Great. Awesome. So my name is Elizabeth Redman, Dr. Elizabeth Redman, and I'm thrilled to share findings from my dissertation, Living in Crisis, Evaluating Secondary Trauma Among Live-in and Residential Life Staff. This research is deeply personal to me, and it reflects things that I've experienced, that my friends and colleagues have experienced, things I'm sure that you all have experienced or witnessed, and what so many of us carry in this field today. So I hope that I'm not only going to offer insight, but tangible ways forward. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about why this research matters. I'll go into a little bit of the methodology, the key findings from both the survey and the interview data that I did. And then we'll talk about some barriers to staff well-being. I'll provide you with some actionable recommendations at both the supervisory and policy levels. And then we'll get into a little bit of reflection for your own campus and strategies that you can implement as soon as this webinar ends. So let's start off with the core issue. Residential life professionals are often first responders for student trauma, but we're really resourced to process our own exposure. Participants in my study described feeling emotionally depleted, professionally unsupported, and systematically unacknowledged. This isn't just burnout or something that kind of a phrase that kind of filters throughout the field itself, but it's secondary trauma. It's cumulative psychological impact of supporting others in crisis. Emotional labor is embedded within our roles, but because it's often invisible and unsupported, you don't always realize it's happening. It's not often acknowledged. One of my participants shared that they weren't sleeping, they weren't eating, they just had so many things going on that they couldn't be there for their students. And that unprocessed secondary trauma has consequences. That's why we see such high staff turnover. We see diminished student support and long-term emotional harm. This study was designed to give a voice to those experiences and point toward institutional change. So some of the questions that I asked in my research were, what is the nature and duration of the impact of secondary trauma? How does it manifest across roles, experiences, and housing status? What moderating variables like identity or institutional context influence the impact? And how does well-being affect how staff show up in their roles and support their students? These questions helped me frame a mixed methods approach that paired measurable patterns with personal stories. I used a sequential explanatory mixed methods design, starting with the STSAP survey, which was designed by Dr. Jason Lynch, which if you've looked through any of the ACUHO-I journals or webinars, you might have seen his name many times. And I paired the secondary trauma and student affairs professional scale that he developed with some qualitative interviews to kind of get more of that information from the participants and kind of hear their stories specifically. So I had 298 participants. We focused on evaluating avoidance, intrusive thoughts, arousal and reactivity, and negative alteration to mood or cognition. And then for the qualitative phase, I had 12 residential life professionals from that 298 that were from diverse roles, backgrounds, and housing statuses. And I used some inductive coding to explore institutional and identity-based influences on their trauma. This approach allowed me to kind of quantify what's happening and then contextualize why it's happening. My quantitative findings illuminated a widespread reach and intensity of secondary trauma in residential life roles. 53% of the participants met the clinical threshold for secondary trauma with consistent symptom expression across all of the 4 subscales. The highest scores were in avoidance, with an average of 3.7 out of 6, indicating a significant emotional and cognitive disengagement, as well as arousal and reactivity with an average of 3.45, highlighting a persistent physiological stress response like hypervigilance or sleep disruption. I also looked into different subgroups within residential life staff and showed a few key patterns. Live-in staff consistently reported higher trauma symptoms, particularly for intrusive thoughts, which was statistically significant. These staff were more likely to experience rumination, flashbacks, and cognitive preoccupation with student trauma. Early career professionals were also more vulnerable. The regression model that I used found years of experience significantly predicted trauma scores, particularly for newer staff. And then women and LGBTQ plus professionals reported significantly higher symptoms on avoidance and overall trauma scores, suggesting that identity-based exposure and emotional labor are essential components of the stories that they're sharing. To give a voice to this data, some of the quotes that I had from participants were, I replay conversations in my head often because I'm thinking, was that the right thing to do? Did I say the right thing? Did I mess up? I question everything. They also said, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. I had so many things going on that I couldn't be there for my students and I didn't know how to continue. The scale that I used provided a structure, but the stories added that texture and depth that I was looking for. They showed that this isn't just burnout from long hours, but it's trauma exposure from repeated emotionally intense interactions. And it's what happens when your home is your workplace and your staff are your only peers and your support role is never fully turned off at the end of the day. The next major theme from my research centered around barriers to staff well-being, the conditions that allow secondary trauma to accumulate and linger throughout the role. These were blurring of personal and professional boundaries, which I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. For live-in staff, the place that you're supposed to recover and the place that you're supposed to go to at the end of the day is also the place where these crises are happening. One of my participants explained, my apartment was 100 feet away from my office. I had no separation. Once I got my driver's license and could leave campus, I felt so much more present at work. When you're coming home to a same place that's within where you're experiencing all of these situations and all of these crises, it's hard to separate yourself, especially when you have that thought to yourself, like, is somebody going to knock on my door? If there was an intense situation where you're worried about your safety and you then have to go home to a place that's in the building where the safety concern was, you're not really able to separate yourself from that moment. This physical proximity became emotional proximity, and staff felt constantly on alert, unable to rest, and often reliving student stories after hours. Then there's the lack of formal trauma-informed infrastructure. Participants described a lack of consistent or meaningful organizational support, and institutional messaging on wellness often rang hollow compared to the day-to-day realities. One participant shared that there is no organizational support administratively, which then impacts you emotionally and mentally. Another participant shared, we're not in a good spot as a field to support professionals as they endure this type of emotional labor. Supervisory check-ins, when they happened, were described as just performance-related, rushed, or reactive. Staff were left to process incidents involving suicidal ideation, sexual assault, and hospitalization on their own without any other support. Lastly, the compounded stress for marginalized professionals. For LGBTQ plus and BIPOC staff, trauma didn't just come from the students. These participants reported elevated scores on the survey, but more importantly, they described feeling invisible, exhausted, and deeply isolated. Coping became a private and individualized responsibility, and they often use therapy, journaling, debriefing with partners or friends outside of the field, not something supported or encouraged by their institutions. The cumulative message here is pretty clear that residential life professionals are expected to carry others' trauma without space or support to carry their own. These cases aren't isolated, they're systemic signals of a field that is in distress. So where do we go from here? What does all of that mean? First, I think we need to look at supervision. Trauma-informed supervision isn't just about having empathy, it's about structure. Supervisors are often the first and sometimes only point of reflection to staff navigating trauma exposure. Yet few have been trained to recognize trauma symptoms or create emotionally safe supervisory spaces. Some actionable practices for this are integrating reflective supervision models where check-ins are not just operational, but also emotional. Asking somebody, how has your work impacted you this week? How has it impacted your well-being? Not just, hey, have you completed this task? Talking to them in a person-centered way that focuses on them and how they're doing as a human being and not just an employee. Normalizing emotional debriefing after incidents. So this is providing a structured time, whether it's 15 or 30 minutes or even just 10 minutes, for staff to process their reactions before jumping into reports or administrative reviews. Um, After a crisis incident, it's important to take that time to focus on the person's well-being before you give feedback on how well they did in the situation, what could have been done better, and those more operational tasks. And then providing ongoing education on secondary trauma literacy, including how these symptoms present, such as emotional numbing or hypervigilance, and how to respond with empathy and resources. The next recommendation I have is focused on structural and policy level reform. Secondary trauma is often treated as an individual problem, but as my research has shown, these conditions that sustain it are structural and it is throughout the entire field. Policies often reinforce burnout by offering little room for recovery or recognition of that emotional labor. Some of the recommendations I have are creating recovery time or comp time policies for after high impact incidents like deaths, hospitalizations, or serious conduct cases. Limiting back-to-back duty shifts to reduce the cumulative exposure without reflection or rest. Update job descriptions to name secondary trauma risk and emotional labor explicitly and include this in performance metrics, not just outcome-based tasks. This is, I think, a really key point because I've talked to a lot of professionals, and a lot of them did not realize the emotional labor that went into residential life. Like, you understand that you're working with people, but you don't realize just how much it impacts you, especially living on campus. So putting that as a risk and naming it within the job description is essential. And then lastly, establishing crisis rotation or coverage models to spread emotional exposure more equitably across staff. My last recommendation is focused on equity-centered support. So marginalized professionals in the LGBTQ plus and BIPOC communities reported some of the highest trauma scores in this study. They're often unofficial emotional anchors for students with shared identities, with which compounds emotional labor. The recommendations I have are creating affinity-based support spaces or supervision structures where marginalized staff can process identity-based stress safely. Auditing supervision and crisis management practices to uncover who consistently carries high emotion roles or unresolved labor. Developing trauma-informed counseling benefits and wellness stipends that acknowledge the burden of identity congruent care, and then centering identity in leadership evaluations, including emotional labor and mentorship or of marginalized students as leadership work, not extra work. So on this slide, I want to pause for a moment and invite you to kind of reflect and take a look inward. One of the most powerful takeaways from my research is that institutional culture matters just as much as individual resilience. Trauma doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by context, by support structures, and by silence. So I'm going to pose a few reflection questions for you, and I just want you to think about them as I ask them. These are questions that emerged organically from what participants told me they wished someone had asked. So, do your staff have safe, routine spaces to process emotional labor? My data showed that formal debriefs were rare and something that were wanted by staff. Participants often process trauma alone with partners or in therapy. This lack of workplace processing compounds isolation. And therapy is fantastic. I'm somebody who will always recommend therapy to everybody. But the reality is that you can't always see your therapist immediately when you need it. So being able to offer spaces for debrief, and while debrief sessions in the workplace are not therapy, and they are not meant to be therapy, but it's a way that you can kind of fill in the gaps in between when an individual can have those therapy appointments and can supplement that support. The next question is, what happens after a crisis? Several participants described being praised for handling crises well, but not being asked how they felt afterward. And the work continued, but so did their emotional depletion. Even if somebody handles a situation well, that doesn't mean that they emotionally coped with it. They can still be deeply affected by the situation that happened and be good at the operational part of their job. The next question is, who carries the most invisible labor? LGBTQ plus and BIPOC professionals in particular reported being the go-to supports for students while receiving minimal acknowledgement from peers or supervisors. So that is something that we have to acknowledge and keep in mind when we are supervising other staff or communicating with our peers. Lastly, what institutional practices reinforce burnout as normal? Rotating duty without breaks, meeting culture that rewards overwork, and staff recognition based solely on visibility or output. These are all cultural norms that we can rewire and things that I saw a lot of in my interviews and in my research. So I encourage you to reflect on those questions and maybe take them back to your senior leadership in your departments or your campus to kind of reflect on um, how you're implementing a trauma-informed approach into your space. And then I wanted to provide some strategies that you can implement now, things that don't necessarily require a major budget shift or policy change, things that you can work on as an individual. So these strategies are grounded in my findings and are intentionally designed to be low barrier but high impact. So first, adding a trauma-informed lens to staff meetings. Beginning or ending meetings with a check-in question about the emotional load and modeling those boundaries. Normalize not being on all the time. Embedding emotional labor in supervision. Use reflective prompts monthly. What has been emotionally heavy? What would recovery look like for you this week? What's been weighing on your mind beyond just that operational task list that we usually do in supervision meetings? Designate post-crisis recovery time. And this can start small. A half day off after a student hospitalization response or a major community impact. Um, and in the long term, this should be made a policy, not just a permission. Creating informal peer support spaces. These can be opt-in 30-minute spaces or circles that are co-facilitated by staff. We oftentimes do these for students after serious crises or situations, but we don't often see them for staff because we just assume that staff can handle it on their own. But that's not the case. It's important to emphasize that these aren't therapy, they're community. It's time to share and cope together, but it's not a clinical space for diagnoses or diving into deeper trauma. And then lastly, adding emotional wellness goals to staff development plans. Include reflective goals like build 2 coping strategies that support sustainability in my role. And if your institution runs a wellness campaign, ask whether staff are included in that campaign. And if they're not, this is an easy entry point to be included into it and start that conversation. And I wanted to save some time to have an open discussion, answer any questions, talk about what resonated or surprised you, or just have that open discussion. So I'm happy to open the floor if anybody has anything they'd like to share. And it's totally okay if you don't. I am not afraid to sit in silence or answer questions via email too if you don't feel comfortable sharing right away. All right. I would share my published dissertation with you all, but I'm still waiting for ProQuest to deliver it to the online system. But I'm happy to share my dissertation with all of the attendees to this session and those who are watching the recording.
Hi, my name is Jill Sturdivant. Something that really resonated with me is something I tried to teach or exhibit for or showcase to my entry-level professionals is that sometimes hanging out and being friends with coworkers, it can lead you to talking about the experiences that you've had at work. And so always having a life outside of the workspace, that's something I try to role model and encourage them to do. So their whole support system is not just strictly work, because a lot of times we may talk about a few things for the first 5 minutes that are not work related, but we always go back to work. So that's something I feel like also impacts the burnout piece as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jillian. And that was something that came up with my interviews as well, is even if you have that rule of like, we don't talk about work in this space, it always comes back somehow, some way. And that's because it's affecting us all the time. And it's easier to keep that separation when we're spending time with people who are either not in the field at all, or at least don't work in our specific area. Even if that's somebody that works at your same institution, but works in a completely different department, depending on how big your institution is, it's a little bit easier to have that separation. Chris shared in the chat, the point about formalizing post-incident care across the department is important, as opposed to different areas tackling it individually based on a particular supervisor's style and understanding. Thank you, Chris. That is one of the biggest recommendations that I saw coming out of my research, that there isn't any sort of formal response to crises for staff. For students, we have all different types of policies and protocols to make sure that students are getting the support that they need, but we tend to just have staff deal with it on their own, which clearly is not benefiting them in any way. A question that was submitted before the webinar was if anyone has suffered from physical ailments as a result of stress from the res life job, how have they been able to rebound/return to office or manage the stress? I actually did have one of my participants from the study share with me an incident where, because of the stress related to her jaw completely locked up. And for a while, she couldn't eat food normally. She could only consume liquids. And it was very, like that situation itself was traumatizing for her, but she also had that secondary trauma from the workplace. And what she shared with me was the workplace she was in was a very unhealthy space, emotionally and physically. And she ended up leaving that institution to go to a new one. And her job search focused a lot on understanding the supervisory practices and policies and procedures of that institution before she um, decided to accept a job in that space. So she really utilized that interview time to um, also interview the people that were interviewing her and use that as a way to gain insight into how that institution works. It took her a little while to bounce back, but she does still work in residential life, and she's very happy that she does. And she shared with me that she has gotten a lot better since changing campuses and having a supervisor that focuses on her well-being. Another question that was submitted before the webinar was that they were interested in learning about work-life balance, coping, and the skills to release others' trauma. To release others' trauma, there's not so much that we can do as non-mental health professionals, other than give that person that empathy and support and that space to talk about it. Deeper trauma processing has to happen with a mental health professional. But as educators and first responders in these spaces, we can provide students and staff with skills for coping, such as grounding techniques or outlets or hobbies that they can use to kind of relax themselves and process through these crisis situations. And being able to kind of find different strategies that work, because it's not a one size fits all thing. I always am one to recommend therapy, like I said, but everybody is different, and therapy has loads and loads of different types that can work for each person, and it can take a little while to find what works best for you. But I think it's something that everybody should explore. Does anyone have any other questions, comments, reflections? Okay. I just want to thank everyone for listening to this, and I want to thank Tori and ACUHO-I for the endorsement for my presentation and my research. Um, it was a fantastic experience that I learned a lot from, not only for secondary trauma in residential life, but also just how to do research and learning more about the field. And I'm excited to continue that learning and growing. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to um, connect via email if you would like to, or share any other resources if you need them.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.